He hired her to sweep the dust and keep the silence. He thought he was just giving a desperate woman a place to stay. He had no idea he was about to start a war. The house on the hill was a tomb, and Thomas Granger was its keeper. 3 winters had passed since his wife, Elena, had been lowered into the cold ground, and the silence she left behind had become his only companion. The floors creaked with her memory. The wind against the windows sounded like her last, shallow breaths. He was a ghost in his own life, a man anchored to the past by a grief so heavy it felt like stone. The folks in town called him the widower on the hill. They'd say it with a sad nod, a tip of the hat. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know the questions that haunted him, the ones that gnawed at him in the dead of night when the fire burned low. They saw a man in mourning. They didn't see a man consumed by a mystery he couldn't solve. He spoke to almost no one. Not the preacher, not the fellas at the general store. Most days, the only person he spoke to was Ruth. And Ruth rarely spoke back. It was an arrangement. Quiet for quiet. She'd shown up one afternoon as the sun was bleeding out across the horizon. A bag over her shoulder, a bruise on her cheek, fading from purple to a sick, washed-out yellow. She had no papers, no family to speak of, just a desperation so sharp you could feel it in the air between them. "I can clean," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper, "and I won't cause no trouble. Please." Something in that please made him step aside. It wasn't just begging. It was the sound of a soul standing on its last ledge. So he let her in. He gave her a room, a small wage, and the silence she seemed to crave as much as he did. She swept his floors. She polished the furniture. She moved through the house like a phantom, her presence marked only by the steady, rhythmic scratch of her broom on the old pine boards. He'd watch her from the kitchen doorway, nursing a cup of coffee that was always cold, his hand gripping the frame like he was afraid of falling. She was exactly what he'd asked for. Quiet, unobtrusive, no trouble. But Thomas Granger was about to learn that some truths don't stay buried. And the trouble Ruth was running from wasn't the kind you could sweep under a rug. It started with a limp. So subtle at first, he almost missed it. A slight hesitation in her step. The way she'd lean just a little too hard on the broom when she thought he wasn't looking. He watched her for 3 days, the sight of it stirring something cold and familiar in his gut. A memory he couldn't quite grasp. Finally, he couldn't stand the silence anymore. He stepped out of the kitchen, his voice rougher than he intended. "You're hurt." Ruth froze, just for a second, but it was long enough. The broom stilled in her hands, and the whole house seemed to hold its breath with her. When she turned, her face was a calm, placid mask, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "It's nothing, Mr. Granger." "I'll be the judge of that," he said, his tone softening. He nodded toward the worn armchair by the hearth, the one Elena used to sit in. "Sit. Let me see." She hesitated. A flicker of sheer panic crossed her face before she buried it. She walked to the chair and sat, not like a servant taking an order, but like a prisoner being led to the gallows. She was used to obeying. It was a survival instinct he was starting to recognize. He knelt before her, his movements slow, careful, the way you'd approach a spooked horse. She'd already started to unlace her worn leather boot, but her fingers fumbled. He gently pushed her hands away and took over, his calloused thumbs working the stiff laces. He pulled the boot off, then peeled back the wool sock. And that's when his world split in two. The smell hit him first. Infection, coppery and sour. The skin around her ankle was a mangled mess of raw flesh, dried blood, and angry weeping sores. A makeshift bandage, nothing more than a strip of soiled linen, was wrapped tightly around it. But it wasn't the wound that made the air leave his lungs. It wasn't the blood or the torn skin that made his heart hammer against his ribs. It was what was underneath. Protruding from the flesh, nestled right up against the bone, was a ring of dark, rusted metal. It wasn't a splint. It wasn't a brace. It was a shackle. Thin, yes, but bolted into place, welded shut, a permanent fixture of pain and possession. And etched into the rusted surface, almost hidden by the blood, was a symbol, a strange, intricate design. Two serpents, coiled around a stylized set of scales. It looked almost corporate, like a brand, not a cattle brand. Something colder, more organized. He stared at it, the image burning itself into his mind. Then he looked up at Ruth. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow. She wasn't crying. She wasn't flinching. She was just waiting. She'd been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived. "What is that?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward, her movements practiced, precise, and began to rewrap the bloody linen around the shackle. "You asked if I was hurt," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "I am." "That's not an answer," he growled. "It's the only one I've got." He stood up slowly, a cold dread creeping up his spine. "You need a doctor. That's infected. You'll lose the leg." "No," she said, the word coming out sharp, sudden. "No doctors." Her eyes finally lifted to meet his, and for the first time he saw past the quiet maid. He saw the woman underneath, a woman forged in a fire he couldn't imagine, a life stitched together from ruins. He saw a girl who had learned that pain was safer than hope. "I'd rather lose the leg," she whispered, her voice cracking, "than have them find me. Them. Not him. Them." The room went completely still. The fire in the hearth seemed to shrink. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the same cold that had washed over him when he'd read the telegram with Elena's name on it, next to the word deceased. It was the cold of a truth too terrible to comprehend. He stepped back, gave a single sharp nod, and walked to the kitchen. He didn't come back with bandages. He came back with a bottle of whiskey and his sharpest hunting knife. Ruth's eyes widened in fear. "You're not cutting it off." "Not planning to," he grunted, sitting on the floor beside her. He uncapped the bottle and without another word, poured the raw whiskey directly onto the open wound. She didn't scream. Her whole body went rigid, her knuckles turning white as she clenched her fists, but she didn't make a sound. She just stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace, as if she'd been through this 100 times before. He worked for nearly an hour, his hands steady, his focus absolute. He used the tip of the knife to carefully pry and cut at the edges of the shackle where it was embedded in her flesh. It wasn't just a simple ring, it was a sophisticated mechanism, designed not to hold her in place, but to inflict constant grinding pain. A reminder, a brand of ownership. By the time he finally managed to loosen the bolts and pry the rusted metal apart, her skin was gray and she was slick with sweat. But she hadn't fainted. She hadn't cried. When he pulled the two halves of the shackle away, she just looked down at her freed ankle, then up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in Elena's rocking chair, the fire long dead, turning her words over and over in his mind. Them. The two coiled serpents, the look of organized cruelty. This wasn't the work of one man. This was something else, something bigger. He thought he was just hiding a runaway. He was wrong. He was hiding from an army. The next morning she was gone. Her few belongings were still in her room, folded neatly on the bed. But her boots were missing. The front door was left slightly ajar, as if she'd hesitated, caught between running from him and running toward the danger that awaited her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He bolted outside. Her tracks were faint in the damp earth, the footprint of her injured foot dragging slightly. He followed them, not toward the road, but down the hill, toward the old dilapidated barn. The barn he hadn't set foot in since Elena died. He pushed the heavy door open. It groaned on its rusty hinges. And there she was, curled up in a pile of hay in the far corner, shivering, the fresh bandage he'd applied already soaked through with blood. She was clutching an old, rusted shovel to her chest like it was a rifle. "I thought you might send for the sheriff," she said, her voice weak, not even looking at him. Send someone to take me away. I came myself, he said, his voice softer than he expected. She finally looked up, her eyes filled with a weary confusion. Why? He didn't have an answer, not one he could put into words, so he just walked across the dusty floor and sat in the hay across from her, the same way he used to sit with Elena while she painted wildflowers on the barn walls, humming songs from a country he'd never seen. That barn had known joy once. Now it held this, a girl with iron in her bones and blood in her socks, hiding from an enemy she couldn't name. Tell me, he said. And the dam finally broke. Her real name wasn't Ruth. It was Miriam Beck. She'd been sold, not married at 16, to a man 20 years her senior. A man who promised her father land and delivered her bruises in exchange. He was a pillar of his community, a man of God on Sunday, and a monster behind closed doors. When she ran the first time, he sent men to drag her back. The second time she ran, he took her to a blacksmith in a town that didn't ask questions, and they'd fitted her with the shackle. His mark of ownership, his wedding ring, he'd called it. He told her if she ever ran again, the brand on the shackle would lead his business associates right to her. He didn't have to follow her. His organization would, the coiled serpents. She'd limped her way north, working for scraps, cleaning stables, sleeping in ditches, trading her silence for one more day of survival. Then she saw his notice, a widower on a remote hill, a man who wanted quiet. It had seemed like a sanctuary, a place to finally catch her breath. I wasn't expecting kindness, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the hay-strewn floor. Just a place to bleed without being watched. Thomas sat there for a long time, the weight of her story settling over him. He finally understood the terror in her eyes. It wasn't just a husband she was fleeing. It was a network, a brotherhood of cruelty. He'll come for you, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, a single tear finally tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. They'll come for me. He stood up, his jaw set like granite. Then they'll find me instead. She blinked up at him, confused. Hope was a language she no longer spoke. Stay in the barn, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. I'll bring food. We'll figure this out. You don't even know me. I know enough. As he walked back up the hill, the rising sun casting his long shadow before him, he felt a weight in his chest that wasn't grief. It was something else. Something cold and hard and ready. He hadn't spoken Elena's name aloud in months, hadn't touched her portrait since the funeral. But as he passed it in the hallway on his way to the pantry, he paused. He looked at her smiling face, and a memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. A small, hidden bruise he'd once seen on her wrist. A strange, intricate pattern. He'd asked her about it. She'd brushed it off, said she'd bumped into a table. He looked closer at the portrait, his blood turning to ice. Faintly, just visible on the painted canvas where her sleeve was pushed up, was a mark he'd dismissed as a shadow or a flaw in the paint. It was two coiled serpents around a set of scales. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, a strangled cry caught in his throat. The mystery of Elena's death wasn't a mystery at all. She hadn't been sick. She'd been running, and they had found her. Down in the barn, Miriam Beck closed her eyes and waited for the past to catch up. She had no idea that the man on the hill was now fighting for two ghosts. Thomas didn't just pack food. He packed ammunition. The revelation about Elena had shattered the quiet grief he'd been nursing and replaced it with a cold, burning rage. His wife hadn't succumbed to a sudden fever like the town doctor had said. She'd been silenced. The illness had been a cover story. He saw it all now with sickening clarity. Her sudden bouts of fear, her insistence on locking the doors at night, the way she'd flinch if he came up behind her too quickly. She hadn't been afraid of him. She'd been afraid of who might be following her. He wrapped 2 biscuits, a slab of salted ham, and a jar of peaches in a cloth. But his mind was on the Winchester rifle hanging over the mantelpiece. He walked down to the barn with a purpose he hadn't felt since the war. Each step was heavy, deliberate. He kept glancing back toward the road, half expecting to see a line of riders cresting the hill. Miriam was awake when he entered, the shovel still held tight. The bandage on her ankle was seeping red again. She looked weaker, the fever setting in. He set the basket down without a word. "You need real medicine," he said, his voice flat. "I told you, no doctors," she whispered, her defiance weakened by pain. "Then it's me or nothing." He tore a strip from his own shirt, uncorked the whiskey again, and began to clean the wound. She winced, but her eyes, clouded with fever, searched his face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. This time he had an answer. He sat back on his heels, the bloody rag in his hand. He looked past her, toward the faded wildflowers Elena had painted on the barn wall. "My wife, Elena," he began, his voice thick with a pain that felt brand new. "She died 3 years ago. The doctor said it was a fever that came on fast, but he was lying. Or he was paid to lie." Miriam stared at him, her own pain momentarily forgotten. "She had a mark," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Just like yours. I saw it once. She hid it from me. I don't know what I thought, but I found a drawing of it this morning, the same 2 serpents." The blood drained from Miriam's face. "No," she breathed. "She wasn't sick, was she?" Thomas asked, his eyes locking onto hers. "She was one of you. She was running." Miriam began to tremble, not from fever, but from a dawning horror. "The Brotherhood of Scales," she whispered, naming the nameless fear for the first time. "They claim women as property. They use old laws, forged documents. They have judges, sheriffs in their pocket. If a woman escapes, they hunt her. They call it recovering an asset." She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror and a terrible dawning pity. "If they found her here, oh God, what did they do to you?" "They did nothing to me," Thomas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They made it look like an illness. They left me alive to grieve. The perfect cover. A heartbroken widower who wouldn't ask questions." He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "I sat by her bed and watched her fade, and I did nothing. I let them kill my wife in my own home because I was blind." He looked down at Miriam, and the rage in his eyes was terrifying. "That mistake ends now. They took her from me. They will not take you." That night, a plan began to form. He couldn't go to the local sheriff. Who knew if he was on the payroll? He had to assume everyone was an enemy until proven otherwise. He had one option: Sheriff Markham, 2 counties over. An old friend from the war, a man Thomas knew to be as straight as an arrow. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He wrote a letter, the words stark and urgent. "Markham, I have trouble. The kind you and I saw in the war, not bandits, something organized. They killed Elena. Now they're here for another. I can't trust anyone local. I need you. Granger." He planned to ride out at dawn, but the Brotherhood didn't wait for dawn. Around midnight, a noise woke him from his vigil in the rocking chair. It wasn't the wind, it was the crunch of gravel, a single horse. He moved to the window, his heart pounding. A lone rider sat on a dark horse at the edge of his property line. The man was just a silhouette in the moonlight, but he didn't have to see his face to know who he was. An assessor, a scout. He wasn't there to attack, he was there to watch, to deliver a message. Thomas grabbed the Winchester. He moved onto the porch, the cold wood bare against his feet, and raised the rifle. The rider didn't flinch. He just slowly turned his horse, gave a mock salute, and melted back into the trees. The message was clear. "We see you, we know what you're hiding, and we can get to you whenever we want." Thomas didn't go back inside. He sat on the porch steps, the rifle across his lap, and waited for the sun to rise. The war had come to his doorstep. The next morning, he didn't ride to the post office. He rode straight to Sheriff Markham's office, a 2-day journey he made in one, pushing his old mule to its limit. He found Markham behind his desk, looking older and more tired than Thomas remembered. "Granger," Markham said, surprise in his voice. "Thought you'd hold yourself up for good." "Didn't have a choice," Thomas replied, handing him the sealed letter. Markham read it, his brow furrowing. He read it a second time, then a third. He looked up, his face grim. "Elena, you're sure about this?" "I saw the mark myself, on the girl," Thomas said. "2 coiled serpents." Markham's face went pale. He stood up and walked to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a dusty file, blowing a layer of dust off the cover. He opened it on the desk. Inside were dozens of reports, sketches of the same serpent brand, and missing person notices for women from all over the territory. "The Brotherhood of Scales," Markham said, his voice low. "I've been tracking them for 5 years. They're not just slavers, Thomas. They're a guild. Wealthy, powerful men who believe certain bloodlines of women are their property, passed down through generations. They have documents, some dating back a century. They operate like a legitimate business with lawyers and enforcers." He pointed to a sketch of a man. "This is their leader in this territory, Caleb Rusk, a charismatic preacher who uses the law and the Bible as his weapons." He then pointed to a faded photograph of a young woman. "That's my sister. She was married to one of them. She disappeared 7 years ago. They said she ran off. I know they killed her." The room was silent, the air thick with shared grief and a newfound terrible purpose. "They're not just coming for the girl, are they?" Thomas asked. "No," Markham said, his eyes hard as flint. "They're coming for you too. You're a loose end, a widower who might start asking questions. They can't afford that." He closed the file. "Go home, Thomas. Bar your doors. I'll gather the men I can trust. But it will take time. You have to hold them off." Thomas rode back with a cold certainty in his gut. He wasn't just fighting for Miriam anymore. He was fighting for Elena, for Markham's sister, for every woman in that dusty file. When he got back to the homestead, Miriam was delirious with fever. She tried to stand when he entered the barn, but her leg gave out, and she collapsed. He carried her to the house, ignoring her weak protests, and laid her on the sofa, the one Elena had loved. "You should have left me," she mumbled, her eyes glassy. "It's too late for that," he said, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "They're not just your ghosts anymore. They're mine, too." He spent the day tending to her, forcing broth and water down her throat. He told her stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years about the orchard he and Elena had dreamed of planting. He talked to fill the silence, to keep the fear at bay. As dusk settled, he saw them. 3 riders coming up the hill. They moved with a slow, arrogant confidence. Thomas grabbed his rifle and stood on the porch, his heart a cold, steady drum in his chest. Miriam, roused by the sound of the horses, struggled to sit up, her eyes wide with terror. The lead rider, a man with a cruel smile and dead eyes, stopped just beyond the fence. He wasn't Caleb Rusk. He was an enforcer, the same man from the other night. "Evening, Granger," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "We've come for our property." "She's not property," Thomas said, his voice level. The man chuckled. "That's a matter of legal interpretation. We have a contract, signed and sealed." He held up a rolled parchment. "Now you can hand her over, and we'll overlook your interference, or we can burn this house to the ground with both of you inside." Thomas leveled the rifle, the front sight centered on the man's chest. "You set 1 foot on my land, and I'll send you to hell in pieces." The man's smile didn't falter. He just looked past Thomas, his eyes locking on Miriam through the open doorway. "He can't protect you forever, Miriam. The Brotherhood always collects its debts." Then he did something unexpected. He turned to one of his men. "Leave the package." The second rider dismounted, walked to the fence post, and hung a small, cloth-wrapped object from it. Then they all turned and rode away, swallowed by the twilight. Thomas waited until they were gone, his rifle never wavering. He walked slowly to the fence, his gut twisting. He untied the package and unwrapped it. Inside was a single child-sized leather shoe, worn and scuffed, and tucked inside the shoe was a locket. He opened the locket. On one side was a faded picture of Miriam. On the other, a picture of a little girl with Miriam's eyes. He turned to the house. Miriam was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of unimaginable horror, a single guttural sob escaping her lips. "They have my daughter," she choked out. "Her name is Sarah. I thought she was safe." The game had changed. They weren't just threatening her life. They were threatening the one thing she had left to live for. The locket was a declaration of war, a cruel, calculated move designed to break Miriam's spirit completely. Thomas watched as the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a hollow, bottomless despair. She collapsed onto the sofa, clutching the tiny shoe to her chest, her body racked with silent, agonizing sobs. "I left her with my cousin," she whispered between gasps. "In a town I thought they'd never find. I thought she was safe. I told myself she was safe." "They're liars," Thomas said, his voice a low growl, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "They could be bluffing." "You didn't see their eyes," she cried, looking up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "They don't bluff. They promise, and then they deliver. This is what they do. They find what you love most and they put a chain around it." He knew she was right. The Brotherhood of Scales didn't operate on empty threats. They operated on absolute control. They had found her daughter, and now they held the leash. The air in the small house grew thick with desperation. Every option seemed to lead to a dead end. If they went to the law, the Brotherhood's influence would squash them. If they ran, the Brotherhood's network would find them. If they stayed and fought, Sarah would pay the price. They were trapped. That night, Thomas did the one thing he could think of. He sent a coded telegram to Markham. "They have a child. Name is Sarah. Hostage. Need location. Urgent." For 2 days they lived in a state of suspended terror. Miriam barely ate or slept. She just sat by the window, staring out at the empty hills, the locket clutched in her hand. Thomas fortified the house. He boarded up the back windows, set snares and tripwires in the woods surrounding the property, and cleaned and loaded every firearm he owned. The quiet widower was gone, replaced by the soldier he used to be. The house was no longer a home. It was a fortress, waiting for a siege. On the third morning, a rider appeared on the ridge, not one of the enforcers. A boy, no older than 15, on a fast horse. He rode hard, stopped at the mailbox, dropped a letter inside, and galloped away before Thomas could even get the door open. It was a response from Markham. "Found her. Small parish orphanage west of the river, St. Jude's. The priest is on their payroll. They're holding her there. It's a trap, Thomas. They expect you to go for the girl." The note ended with a chilling warning. "I have men moving, but they are days away. You are on your own. St. Jude's." The place was a fortress in its own right, known for its high walls and strict, isolated discipline. A perfect place to hide a child in plain sight. "It's a trap," Thomas said, showing the note to Miriam. "They want to lure us away from here, separate us." "I don't care," Miriam said, her voice eerily calm. The despair had been burned away, leaving behind something hard and sharp. "I am not leaving my daughter in their hands. If it's a trap, then we'll walk right into it." "They'll kill us, Miriam." "They will kill her if we do nothing," she countered, standing up, her limp more pronounced, but her posture defiant. "I've spent years running from them. I've spent years letting them take everything from me. My name, my freedom, my life. They will not take my child. This ends. Now, one way or another." He saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in young soldiers before a charge they knew they wouldn't survive. It was the look of someone who had already accepted their own death and was now focused only on the mission. "All right," he said after a long silence, "but we do this my way." His plan was insane. It was reckless. It was almost certainly a suicide mission, but it was better than waiting for the hangman. The plan had two parts: deception and attack. He spent the day making it look like they were abandoning the homestead. He packed supplies onto his mule, left the front door wide open, and made a set of obvious tracks leading east, away from the farm. It was a crude deception, but he hoped it would be enough to make the Brotherhood scouts believe they were running. Then, under the cover of darkness, he and Miriam slipped out the back. They didn't take horses. They went on foot, moving through the dense woods like ghosts, circling west toward St. Jude's. It was a grueling trek. Miriam's ankle screamed with every step, but she never complained. The thought of her daughter fueled her, pushing her past the limits of her pain. They arrived on the outskirts of the orphanage just before dawn on the second day. It was just as Markham had described: a grim, stone compound surrounded by a high wall topped with broken glass. A single iron gate was the only way in or out. 2 guards stood watch, armed with rifles. "They'll be expecting us at the gate," Thomas whispered as they hid in a thicket, observing the compound. "But they won't be expecting this." He pulled out the schematics for the orphanage. Markham had included them in his letter. They were old, but they showed something crucial: an old sewer drain that ran from the riverbank, under the wall, and emptied into the orphanage's laundry room. It was their only way in. The journey through the sewer pipe was hellish. The air was foul, the passage was tight, and the dark was absolute. But after what felt like an eternity, they saw a sliver of light. They emerged, covered in filth, into the steamy, dark laundry room. The orphanage was quiet, the children still asleep. They moved silently through the hallways, following the map toward the dormitory wing. But as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a priest holding a lantern. It was Caleb Rusk, the charismatic preacher, the leader of the territory's Brotherhood chapter. He smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't surprised to see them. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "A mother's love is such a predictable thing." He gestured down the hall with his lantern. "She's in the chapel, waiting for you. I thought a reunion in the house of God would be appropriate." It was a trap within a trap. They hadn't been discovered. They had been allowed in. Thomas raised the pistol he was carrying, but Rusk just chuckled. "Go ahead, Mr. Granger. Shoot me. My men have orders. The moment they hear a shot, they set fire to the chapel, with your daughter inside." Checkmate. They had no choice. They followed Rusk down the long, cold hallway, the sense of dread growing with every step. He led them to the heavy oak doors of the chapel and pushed them open. The room was lit by dozens of candles. At the far end of the aisle, tied to the altar, was a small girl with wide, terrified eyes. "Sarah!" Miriam cried, starting forward. Rusk tutted, grabbing her arm. "Not so fast!" From the shadows behind the pews, men emerged, a dozen of them, all armed. They were surrounded. "You see," Rusk said, his smile widening as he savored his victory. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Miriam. A bad investment. But you're going to be useful one last time. You're going to sign a confession. You'll admit to being a runaway, a thief, and an unfit mother. You will renounce your claim to your daughter and legally sign her over to the care of the Brotherhood. Then, Mr. Granger will be dealt with for his interference, and you will be returned to your rightful place." He pushed a document and a pen into her hands. "Sign it, or you can watch your daughter pay for your sins." Miriam looked at her terrified child. She looked at the smirking face of her tormentor. She looked at Thomas, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. She took the pen. She walked toward the altar, her steps heavy. She knelt before her daughter, whispering something Thomas couldn't hear. Then she stood, turned to Rusk, and looked him dead in the eye. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. Rusk's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said no." She tore the confession in half and threw it on the floor. "You can kill me. You can kill us both. But you will not have my daughter. You will not have my soul." "Foolish woman," Rusk snarled, raising a hand to strike her. But the blow never landed. Suddenly, the chapel's stained glass windows exploded inwards, showering the room in a cascade of colored glass. Men in dark clothing rappelled down ropes from the ceiling, dropping into the pews. Gunshots erupted, not from Thomas's pistol, but from all around them. Sheriff Markham stood in the shattered frame of the main window, a smoking shotgun in his hands. "The Brotherhood of Scales!" he yelled over the chaos. "By the authority of the territorial marshals, you are all under arrest for slavery, kidnapping, and murder." Rusk's men were caught completely by surprise. The chapel turned into a war zone. Thomas didn't hesitate. He tackled Rusk to the ground while Miriam ran to the altar, shielding Sarah with her own body. The fighting was brutal and quick. Markham's men were professionals, moving with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, it was over. The Brotherhood's men were either dead or in chains. Thomas dragged Caleb Rusk to his feet and slammed him against a pillar. "It's over, Rusk." Rusk, his face bloody and his fine coat torn, just laughed, a ragged, insane sound. "Over? You think this is over? You have no idea. The Brotherhood is not a dozen men in a church. We are everywhere. We are the law. You haven't won anything. You've just signed your own death warrants." He looked past Thomas at Miriam, who was now holding her sobbing daughter. "Enjoy your reunion," he spat. "It will be a short one." As Markham's deputies dragged him away, his laughter echoed through the desecrated chapel. It wasn't the sound of a defeated man. It was the sound of a man who knew he was just one severed head of a hydra, and that more were waiting in the shadows. They hadn't won the war. They had just survived the first battle, and the enemy now knew exactly who they were. The victory at St. Jude's felt hollow. Caleb Rusk was in chains, and Miriam had her daughter back, but his parting words echoed in Thomas's mind. "We are everywhere." Sheriff Markham confirmed their worst fears as they rode away from the still smoldering orphanage. "Rusk is just a chapter president," he explained, his face grim. "The Brotherhood is an institution. It has deep roots and deeper pockets. They have judges on their payroll, senators who owe them favors. They own men you wouldn't believe. So the law can't protect us," Thomas stated, the reality settling in like a winter chill. "The law is a tool," Markham said grimly, "and right now they hold the handle. Rusk will be free in a week, a month at most. They'll find a legal loophole, bribe a judge, or he'll simply escape custody. And when he gets out, he won't send enforcers. He'll send an army." They returned to Thomas's homestead, not as a sanctuary, but as a temporary outpost in a war they were losing. The small farmhouse, once a tomb of grief, now felt fragile, vulnerable. Sarah, a quiet, traumatized child, clung to her mother, flinching at every loud noise. Miriam was whole again, but the fear for her daughter was a constant, suffocating presence. The news of the raid at St. Jude's spread like wildfire. But the story that reached the newspapers was twisted. It wasn't a heroic rescue. It was an attack on a holy place. Vigilantes, led by disgraced widower, attack orphanage, the headlines screamed. Thomas Granger was painted as a lunatic, and Miriam as a hysterical runaway who had kidnapped her own child. The Brotherhood's propaganda machine was powerful and efficient. They were being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Soon, the letters started arriving. Anonymous threats, a drawing of a hangman's noose, a single scorched feather, a symbol of the Brotherhood's promise of cleansing fire. Then, the visitors started coming. Not enforcers, women. The first was a woman named Hannah, who appeared at their doorstep one night, her face bruised, her 2 young sons trailing behind her. "I read about you," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the road. "The papers called you a villain, but I knew. I knew you were telling the truth. My husband, he bears the mark." She showed them the coiled serpent brand on a deed to her farm. Her husband hadn't just married her, he had acquired her. Within a week, 3 more women arrived. Each had a similar story. Each was fleeing a husband, a father, or a brother who was a member of the Brotherhood. Each was considered property. Thomas's farm became a makeshift refugee camp. The barn was turned into a dormitory. The women shared chores, tended to the children, and lived under a constant cloud of fear. The homestead on the hill was no longer a hideout. It was a symbol. It was the first organized pocket of resistance, and that made it the Brotherhood's #1 target. Sheriff Markham did what he could. He deputized Thomas and a few of the more capable women. He sent them what supplies he could spare, but he was one man against a shadow empire. The first direct attack came without warning. They didn't ride up to the house, they used fire. One night, the barn went up in flames, the dry wood catching instantly. Thomas and the others managed to get everyone out, but the message was clear. The fire had been set with an expert's precision, designed to cause terror and chaos. Scrawled in ash on the side of the well were 2 words: "Return our property." They had moved from threats to open warfare. The pressure was immense. Food was running low. The constant vigilance was exhausting everyone. Some of the women wanted to scatter, to run and hide again. It was Miriam who held them together. The woman who had arrived as a terrified, silent mouse had transformed into a leader. "If we run alone," she told them, her voice ringing with newfound strength as they gathered in the farmhouse kitchen. "And they will hunt us down, one by one. But if we stand together. Here. We make this ground our own. We make them come to us." Inspired by her courage, they stayed. They dug in for a siege. They turned the farmhouse into a veritable fortress, reinforcing the walls, setting up a perimeter, and establishing a round-the-clock watch. Thomas watched Miriam, a sense of awe overriding his fear. She was no longer a victim. She was a general. She was writing her own story now, and she was writing it in gunpowder and defiance. But their defiance was about to be met with overwhelming force. A few days after the fire, a lone rider approached, waving a white flag. It was a lawyer, a smarmy, well-dressed man from the city. He didn't deliver a threat. He delivered a legal document, an official court order signed by a powerful territorial judge. The document declared that the women at the Granger farm were fugitives from their legal guardians. It gave Thomas Granger 24 hours to turn them over to the authorities. If he failed to comply, he would be charged with kidnapping and treason, and the U.S. Marshals would be authorized to use lethal force to reclaim the stolen property. The Brotherhood wasn't just sending thugs anymore. They were coming with the full, terrifying power of the law on their side. They had successfully turned the protectors into the criminals. "It's a death sentence," Hannah said, her voice trembling as she read the order. "They'll send the marshals. We can't fight the law." "It's not the law," Miriam said, her eyes blazing. "It's a perversion of it. It's a weapon they're using to keep us in chains." She looked around at the faces of the other women, at their children. Then she looked at Thomas. "They think their paper and their judges give them power, but we have a power they can't understand." "What power?" one of the women asked, her voice full of despair. Miriam picked up a pen and a blank sheet of paper from the kitchen table. "Our stories," she said. "We're going to fight their law with the truth." They had 24 hours before the world declared them outlaws. Miriam spent every second of it writing. She didn't write a defense, she wrote a declaration. With the help of the other women, she compiled a dossier of testimony, page after page of sworn statements, detailing the abuses of the Brotherhood, names, dates, locations, the stories of beatings, of brandings, of children sold or taken. They wrote about the judges who ignored their pleas, the sheriffs who returned them to their abusers. It was a raw, unfiltered history of the shadow empire that had ruled their lives. At the bottom of the last page, Miriam wrote a simple, powerful plea. "This is not a legal dispute. This is a matter of human souls. We do not ask for mercy. We ask for justice, and we will defend our lives and our freedom on this land until that justice is won, or we are all dead. Judge us not by their laws, but by our truths." They made a dozen copies. At dawn, just hours before the court order expired, Thomas and two of the women rode out in three different directions. They didn't ride to the courthouse. They rode to every newspaper office, every telegraph station, and every church within 100 miles. They nailed the declaration to the doors of town halls and general stores. They weren't just fighting a siege. They were starting a revolution. They were taking their case directly to the people. As the sun reached its zenith, marking the end of their 24 hours, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a small group of enforcers. It was a column of at least 50 riders, moving with military precision. At their head was a man in the clean, crisp uniform of a U.S. Marshal, and beside him, on a fine black horse, was Caleb Rusk, a smug look of triumph on his face. He had been released, just as Markham had predicted, and he had come to collect. The women and children gathered inside the farmhouse. Thomas stood on the porch, his Winchester in his hands, flanked by Hannah and another woman, both armed with rifles. They were hopelessly outnumbered. The marshal rode forward, holding up the court order. "Thomas Granger," he boomed, "in the name of the United States government, I order you to lay down your arms and surrender the fugitives you are harboring." "They're not fugitives," Thomas yelled back, his voice steady. "They're free women, and this is their home." "You are in violation of a federal court order," the marshal shouted. "This is your last chance. Surrender, or we will open fire." Thomas looked back at the farmhouse, at the faces of the children peering through the windows. He looked at Miriam, who stood just inside the doorway, her expression one of grim resolve. This was it. The end of the line. He raised his rifle. "You want them?" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage and defiance. "You'll have to come through me." Rusk smiled and gave a nod to the marshal. The marshal raised his hand, about to give the order to attack, but before he could, another sound filled the air. Not gunfire, hoofbeats, hundreds of them. From the east, a second dust cloud was approaching, even larger than the first. Rusk and the marshal turned, their expressions shifting from triumph to confusion. Cresting the hill was not an army. It was a sea of ordinary people, farmers with pitchforks and hunting rifles, shopkeepers from town, closing their stores to ride out, blacksmiths, their arms still sooty from the forge, and at their head, on a tired horse, was Sheriff Markham. They hadn't come to fight the law. They had come to question it. They poured onto the field, forming a living, breathing wall between the marshals and the farmhouse. They didn't raise their weapons. They just sat on their horses and wagons, their faces set, their silence a powerful rebuke. The marshal was stunned. "What is the meaning of this? Disperse immediately. This is official government business." An old farmer, a man Thomas recognized from the feed store, spat on the ground. "We read the letter, Marshal," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We read their stories. That court order of yours might be law, but it ain't right, and we ain't moving." Rusk's face contorted in a mask of fury. "These are my assets, my property. The law is on my side." From the porch, Miriam stepped out into the sunlight. All eyes turned to her. She looked not at the marshal, but at the crowd of townspeople. "For years, men like Caleb Rusk have used the law as a shield to hide their crimes," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the field. "They have counted on your silence. They have counted on your fear. Today, you have shown them that a community is more powerful than a corrupt law. You are the true justice." A murmur went through the crowd. The marshal, a man used to unquestioning authority, looked uncertain for the first time. He was a lawman, but he was not a fool. To open fire now would not be enforcing a court order. It would be a massacre. He looked at Rusk, whose face was purple with rage, and then at the silent, determined wall of citizens. He lowered his hand. "Stand down," he ordered his men. Rusk screamed in protest. "You can't! They are defying the law!" The marshal turned his horse to face him, his eyes cold. "The situation has changed, Mr. Rusk. It seems you have a civil dispute on your hands. The U.S. Marshals are not your personal army." He looked out at the sea of armed farmers. "We will be withdrawing to await further clarification from the territorial governor." With that, he turned his column and rode away, leaving Caleb Rusk and his few remaining thugs alone, facing a small army of their own neighbors. Rusk stared, his mouth agape, his power evaporating before his eyes. The law had abandoned him. He looked at the farmhouse, at Miriam standing tall and defiant on the porch. He looked at Thomas Granger, whose rifle was still aimed at his heart, and he looked at the faces in the crowd, faces that had once shown him deference, now filled with contempt. He had lost, not to bullets, but to words, to the truth. He snarled, a final impotent sound of rage, and spurred his horse, galloping away in a cloud of dust, a king with no kingdom. The crowd erupted in a cheer. The siege was broken. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Miriam stood on the porch, tears finally streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. Thomas lowered his rifle and walked to her side, putting his arm around her. Beside them, Sarah watched, a small, tentative smile gracing her lips for the first time in months. The house on the hill was still standing. It was more than a fortress now. It was a beacon, a testament to the fact that even the most powerful darkness can be pushed back by ordinary people who have the courage to stand together in the light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. You never know what truths are hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to drag them into the light.